Um, Thank you for the invitation to be here with you all today for this discussion. We would like to present our work for the next 1 hour and then open it up to any questions or thoughts that you have relative to the planning work that's happening for your town or city. Um, we will be sharing some of our professional experiences in planning and design with thoughts on post-war planning and reconstruction with lessons from Kabul. My name is Marianne Ocampo. I am an urban design principal at a firm called Sasaki, who works on urban planning and urban design throughout an international kind of setup of working in Afghanistan to Malaysia to a lot of work in the United States. And I'm joined by my colleague Ali Khan Mohammed, who is also a senior urban planner at Sasaki. I am also an associate professor of the practice of urban design and planning at MIT, where I begin to teach about urban design strategies that consider sustainability, resilience, and inclusive design as we think about cities, neighborhoods, and communities. So I think that what we'll do at this point is we'll share our slides. If we can open and have access to the screen, I will ask my colleague Ali Khan uh, to share his slides. Great. So thank you. So post-war planning and reconstruction lessons from Kabul is a particular project that Sasaki, our urban design firm, worked on from 2017 for 2 years, working with the president of the country and the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing. Next slide. This framework was really a vision for Kabul as the capital city of Afghanistan and thinking about what we could project in the next 10 to 30 years as far as how we were understanding housing, economic development, and environmental systems and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So for today, we're going to focus on 5 elements that we'll be sharing with lessons embedded in each of these elements. First, we'll speak to the context and the understanding of the project in itself. Second, sharing our approach to reconstruction, knowing the geopolitics of Afghanistan and Kabul as being under extreme kind of dynamic change, what that history has meant, and what the future, as far as any planning work in regards to rebuilding and reconstruction, could be, how it could be strategized. We'll share design strategies as well that look to citywide systems, big ideas relative to significant projects, and how those could be implemented. We'll speak to who are we planning for as we begin to understand different populations that are more vulnerable relative to thinking about women in the city or socioeconomic divides that exist within Kabul. And then finally, we'll end with implementation and our thoughts towards implementations and lessons learned relative to this project. Next slide, please. So for context, next, um, Afghanistan for us has many different challenges that have been created by decades of conflict and instability. For example, informal housing precariously sited on the steep hills that you see in this photograph, as well as a rich history, resilient society, and diverse opportunities that were present in a capital city that has been a cultural and economic seat for centuries. Next slide. We were asked to create a visionary and yet feasible, achievable urban design vision that the president and government officials could implement, reimagining Kabul's future as the capital city of Afghanistan, emerging from those decades of conflict towards a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient development kind of model, tackling the physical and social dimensions as we thought about our process, but also ways to think about future strategies of implementation. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that in order for us to understand really the importance of Kabul in the context of Afghanistan's recent history of conflict and reconstruction, we can see, for example, the fact that almost 10% of the country's population has been displaced, and that many of these people were living in temporary arrangements in the capital city, seeking safety and stability. So, how are we beginning to accommodate the migrations of people that were coming to Kabul and the need for housing stability relative to economic development and infrastructure that would be part of this capital city? So on the next slide, you'll see that this team was with such a nationally significant project. We had a very large team of people who collaborated on this effort. Our process, again, was 2 years long with many meetings with President Ghani and the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing team, as well as working with non-government organizations, city officials, and so forth. Team members would travel to get to locations that were safe for meetings that would happen in person, and that there were a lot of kind of virtual meetings that would happen as well. And so part of this was oscillating between Boston, Dubai, and Washington, D.C. We worked with a lot of ways that we had to really fill the gaps in for data that was missing relative to our city planning work. We had to connect with a lot of different organizations to facilitate institutional kind of overlaps that needed to be kind of bridged. And then we would work towards synthesizing and graphically communicating the findings through our report of how we were thinking about communicating different ideas, different strategies, and what the storytelling was relative to the visual stories and the narrative that we were creating to really reimagine Kabul after many years of conflict, of which we were also still part of during that time. So there was a review process. You can see all of the team members located on this slide that showed some of the folks that we worked with on throughout those 2 years. And just knowing that it took a large team working together to share and build up capacity as far as that knowledge base and sharing data to really think about this kind of comprehensive urban design framework. Next slide. And so, lessons learned from our work, understanding the context of Kabul in its geopolitical kind of challenges, is that number one, we thought about positionality. As a private consulting firm at Sasaki, what is our role within design practice, within the larger goal of national reconstruction, and what the city officials and the president was trying to do, and then also understanding the landscape of international aid in the historic geopolitical context. Where are we in history? How is the work that we're doing setting up a way that we will be part of our future will be part of a kind of past history? How is time part of that kind of key ingredient in regards to how one plans? Second, we wanted to really think about acknowledging the challenges faced by people and institutions and build that into the way that we were planning to understand what those barriers are. Third, setting expectations about how and where planning and design has the agency to drive change. So in this case, we strongly believe in design as a tool to drive change and to have hope and aspirations that can be implemented. last, helping to build consensus and support with the many other organizations and institutions working in this space, reinforcing and leveraging the great work that many people do, and how we can actually work together to drive change forward. So next is a section focused on approach. And for us on the next slide, you will see that our framework was intended to serve a variety of purposes for Kabul and this planning work. First, it's a vision for the future of Kabul's development and would enable NGOs, government agencies, private entities, and the public to coordinate investments and activities so that the city is moving forward in a consistent, direct way together. The second purpose of the plan was to provide technical guidance for development in Kabul. So citywide systems is denoted in this kind of series of 6 volumes that explains these concepts across the range of development, landscape, mobility, and infrastructural systems. Next slide. For us, the first thing as part of our approach was understanding what the key drivers are. And it really was focused on population growth, civil transformation, geopolitical shifts. All of those factors have impacts on Kabul's development. Certain issues would rise to the surface as major forces that shape Kabul in very particular ways. And so for us, it was creating a way to identify those drivers through an iterative process of and reflection on the issues raised by the stakeholders and in consideration of the larger forces at play in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So we are constantly zooming in and out relative to the city, the region, and the country to understand what the trends um, are telling us as far as positioning Kabul relative to the larger kind of national aspirations. One of the major drivers was focus on housing. Kabul is in the midst of a population boom. And so one question that we had was how can the city provide new housing and improve existing neighborhoods? Rapid growth for Kabul's kind of population shows that in 2017, we are at a point where the kind of acceleration of growth is well beyond 2 million by the time we were in 2024, 25 today. But we also saw that there wasn't enough data to tell us exactly what that floating population was, but that we would need to anticipate potentially up to 4.5 million people in the city of Kabul. The next slide goes to understanding the economy, an economy for the 21st century. And a question that we asked is how can Kabul invest in its citizens and create economic opportunity? Kabul is a diverse and young city with a labor force poised for rapid growth. Approximately 1.7 million young men and women will enter the labor force over the next 15 years. However, in both geographic and demographic kind of terms, access to education remains uneven across the city. So, how could we think about educational institutions at this time in 2017, knowing today that it has drastically changed? But what are those educational institutions doing as we think about the economic pipeline throughout the country and within the city? The next slide focuses on a question that's really getting towards connectivity. How can Kabul develop efficient mobility systems at a metropolitan scale? So, with rapid growth, as we think about that growing population and who we're serving as the people, we understand that growth and how you connect infrastructure for different modes of mobility is very important. So we saw with rapid population growth that has really strained Kabul's road infrastructure, creating unpredictable bottlenecks and congestions throughout the city. Solving these traffic challenges required a shift towards balanced transport networks that combine transit, biking, walking, vehicles into an integrated system. So, how are we thinking about this relative to access to different areas of the city during extreme events, during war, but also understanding the everyday lives of people relative to jobs and where they live? On the next slide, we also show that a major driver for us was looking at public spaces and recreation. And in this case, it was focused on how can the city restore its landscape and create places for all the residents of Kabul to enjoy. So public space is essential to the health and well-being of a city. There are places where the city gathers, where the diversity of the city is on full display, even though there's a lot of veiling and invisibility that happens, in particular for women of Kabul. But understanding where activities like recreation, sports, leisure take place. Kabul today has several kind of outstanding examples of public space, but with population growth, where can we begin to protect the kind of natural open spaces and places for the public to actually convene and gather? Water is the prerequisite for growth. We know that we need to understand the water infrastructure for any city. And so, which strategies can ensure a stable water supply for a growing city? In many ways, water, we believe, will be the defining issue for Kabul's development for the 21st century. Years of depletion and pollution highlight the need for solutions as far as the lack of drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, just basic needs. These should be strategies that replenish the aquifers, create new sources of drinking water through dams and other infrastructure, and that guide development into locations and patterns that minimize the impacts on water quality and availability. We also want to think about equitable access to the city. And so Kabul's success will be linked to the success of all Kabulis. And so for us, how can Kabul provide equal opportunity and equitable access to amenities for everyone? Access to civic kind of necessities such as education, healthcare, and other community needs is essential element of a vibrant city. Today, Kabul has a network of important institutions, and yet for too many people, these resources are inaccessible. So expanding access to opportunity for all residents will require a mix of mobility improvements and balancing the distribution of services across the city. So rapid population growth makes more urgent the need for proactive strategies for expanding access. And so part of this, as far as our lessons learned in this approach, was that we were looking at the interconnectedness of each of these different drivers and how they're this kind of holistic vision that we created in kind of the reconstruction and post-war planning of Kabul was holistically understood, but it was made up of these interdependent systems of environmental, economic, cultural, and spatial kind of frameworks. We also note that urban design is a tool to inspire society and envision the potential of a city and its people. President Ghani specifically had addressed that he needs a vision that could be implemented but also provides inspiration and hope. Nation building. We also asked, what does it mean to reconstruct or rebuild a town, city, or country? And how do you go about it relative to a process that's inclusive and leverages different institutional and organizational players between local, national, and international? and how do you prioritize through your decision making what that kind of holistic planning effort is. And then part of this approach, always knowing for us working with the city, is that planning for and responding to uncertainty was just part of an acknowledgement that we had to consider every day during our work, and knowing that things could shift and change and being flexible enough to adapt to that change throughout the process. So I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Ali Khan, who will be presenting some of the design strategies.
Я в процесі хотів би ще сказати, що в нас
I also would like to say that we have some questions. Maybe we will get it to the Q&A session in the end.
І тоді повернемося до цих питань. Щоб вже не переривати.
Yes, so I think we will not break, yes, your lecture, right? We will get to the Q&A at the end of the lecture, right?
I think we could have a discussion at the end and address the questions. These are great questions that we'll be happy to kind of have as a discussion.
Perfect. I'll continue then. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Marianne. In this section, I'll talk about how we took some of the broader goals and understandings and the key drivers that Marianne walked us through, and talk about how we embedded those in different design strategies and different systems. And one thing that we kept in mind, or we tried to keep in mind, was the urgent need to provide basic infrastructure in a city and a context where there was a huge need and not a huge capacity to deliver them. We wanted to balance this with the desire to really create concepts that were tangible, that people could identify with and be inspired by. We looked at 4 citywide systems: land use and development, landscape and ecology, which included open space networks as well as water management. We looked at mobility, which included both roadways as well as transit networks. And finally, basic infrastructure like electricity and sewage. In this section, we focused on creating technical guidelines and really working with the different entities and departments that were in charge or tasked with these different systems. But we were also careful to understand our role as a group of people through the President's Office and the Ministry of Urban Development, who could make sure that these priorities were aligned and in sync. For each system, in this case mobility, we analyzed the geometry of the network, the conditions of the roadways, and the capacities of the network, and we mapped them onto existing cross-cutting factors like population density and topography to understand them in the context of the city. We identified a hierarchy of roadways from major corridors that served as arteries connecting different parts of the city to neighborhood spines and local roads that served individual districts and neighborhoods. One of the things that jumped out to us was that the major arteries and corridors were well defined, but in between them, there were neighborhoods that covered dozens of acres and had thousands of people, where there were few paved roads or places to bring infrastructure in. And so it became apparent that these arteries were really important as the backbone of a system, not just for transportation, but also as a clear way to provide infrastructure trunk lines, as well as shape urban development. For each of these hierarchies, we identified where the major corridors were to provide a clear roadmap of where investments could and should be targeted, as well as detailed specifications around roadway width, infrastructure, the integration of mobility, sidewalks, the public realm, as well as landscaping and trees. We looked again at these roadways as multifunctional corridors for both transportation, but also as a way to bring infrastructure from electricity to drinking water to solid waste services into these neighborhoods. So we were looking at each system, but always with an eye towards integration. In terms of development, we looked at how each of these arteries could structure future development and provide capacity for housing and economic opportunity. We identified publicly owned parcels and major opportunities for development so that as we developed the overall urban design framework, the transportation, BRT networks, etc., would be aligned with future development as well. That all came together into this urban design framework, which encompassed both urban land use, but also mobility systems and ecological and landscape systems, as well as served as a guiding reference for infrastructure and other agencies that were involved and integral to supporting development. Now, at the same time, we were very conscious of creating concrete visions and concepts that would be tangible, that NGOs, different departments, citizens, and the government could really be inspired by and take action around. We called this a project-based approach to city shaping. And the idea was that the capacity for regulation and enforcement of, for example, land use and development policies was extremely weak. So we tried to envision 10 different design concepts or big ideas that could physically shape and mold how development happened at the city level. The 10 concepts that we envisioned and focused on across the process were corridors as catalysts, regenerating the central city, expanding to the east, so understanding the general direction and suggesting a general direction for that massive population growth, understanding a ring road as 3 different zones and how each of those zones could shape development in a different way, integrating all of the organic neighborhoods that had sprung up informally over 2 decades of conflict and a lack of planning, creating sustainable infrastructure, developing a network of higher education and universities that were distributed equitably around the city, connecting agriculture and the city. There were a couple of major agricultural belts that spanned through the city and that were being encroached on by rapid development. So seeking ways to actually balance the need and the historical presence of agriculture within the city with the desire for urban growth and the need for new housing. We looked at cultural and ecological conservation, identifying the key historic parks, plazas, and landmarks that define the identity of the city's culture and history. And finally, looking for clear opportunities to create and cultivate new public spaces. One example of this was a neighborhood called Bibi Maru, which was a hillside community that had sort of evolved quite precariously on a hillside in the center of town, right next to one of the major corridors. We chose this as one of several specific communities to illustrate how land use, infrastructure, community amenities, and ecological strategies could be integrated as part of a development and neighborhood upgrading project. And you can see from these photos that there's a clear lack of basic infrastructure, drainage, erosion, and other things were all major issues faced by this neighborhood. The first thing we looked at was access and connectivity. How could we create and designate opportunities for strategic infill housing close to the major corridor where access was already good? And how can we identify local streets where there's opportunities to upgrade and reinforce accessibility to the interior of the neighborhood and support the roadways and the little alleyways with infrastructure for drainage, green infrastructure, and ecological solutions. The next thing we did was to overlay and find opportunities for social infrastructure, including community centers, small plazas, playgrounds, and opportunities for community agriculture. We also identified an opportunity for the marketplace, which is kind of in the bottom left here, that could serve as an economic opportunity for the neighborhood, as well as a gateway and a connection to the larger vision of the city. Finally, we made sure that we were also integrating strategies such as contour swales, retaining walls, and green infrastructure to manage stormwater erosion and sanitation challenges that were inherent in this densely populated neighborhood on a steep hillside. So we made sure that as we were putting together this concrete, compelling vision for a neighborhood that the residents could rally around, we were also thinking about the role and contribution of different community organizations, nonprofits, infrastructure line departments, and other entities, and using this as really an example or pilot to show how all of these different groups of people and organizations could come together. And for each of these, we really tried to create a compelling vision that was grounded in these very discrete, concrete, and implementable actions and projects, but could also present an inspiring vision that drew on the culture and the community, the people and the landscape, and really show what the potential of this neighborhood and the city could be in 10 or 15 or 20 years. So again, the kind of lessons that we took and the approach that we developed was to make sure that we had a very clear technical approach for the citywide systems, and that we could communicate clearly and incorporate all of the projects and priorities of the different international organizations, national and local infrastructure departments, etc., to make sure that they were together and accommodated within this vision. We wanted to make sure that we were integrating natural systems as well as urban systems and really understand the fragile nature of Kabul's ecosystem. We really wanted to make sure that we were identifying tangible and clear opportunities for specific demonstration projects. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that everything linked back, both the individual projects and the systems, to citywide goals and national priorities. And as we went through all of these networks and one of these big ideas, a persistent theme, both for ourselves as well as in the direction from the president and the national government, was to ask for whom we're planning for and to make sure that we're including, opportunity for all of Kabul citizens. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Marianne to talk about how we address this question, planning for whom.
Great, thank you, Ali Khan. So part of our process was really understanding who the residents of Kabul were and are. And on the next slide, we had a really interesting conversation with President Ghani, who asked, how do you design a city such as Kabul for women, where there are cultural practices that are making women invisible, and there are certain amenities and basic services that are not accommodating women of Kabul. And so, how do we turn the streets into a place of interaction and joy rather than fear? Kabul needs dedicated spaces for women, families, and youth. The issue that has not received significant attention is that our women have very little outdoor space. And so this was a very interesting way that we heard a kind of declaration or a statement from the president in regards to how are you very specifically designing for women in Kabul. And so on the next slide, we had to ask ourselves, what's our role? relative to planning and design, and how can we think about policies and projects that would start to really think about women's role within society, and how do we make space for that? How do we think about empowering women in Kabul? And so with that, we were really did a huge history dive into the women of Kabul, the Queen Consort of Afghanistan and wife of King Emanuela Khan, was Queen Soraya Tarzi, who would begin to be a figurehead in the 1920s of a modern Kabul, and looking to her relative to her role, and how much it changed over time, and where we were today was part of this process. On the next slide, what you'll see is a timeline from the 1920s, with Queen Soraya Tarzi really being part of a movement that was talking about the modern woman in a more democratic society of Afghanistan and Kabul. But what we found is that over time, in the 1950s, there was gender segregation that was happening. By the 60s, women were becoming more active in civil society, and there were ways in which women gained the right to vote, with dignity, education, and freedom to work. In the 1950s, there was gender segregation that was abolished. So from the 1920s to the 1950s, we're seeing huge changes happening. And that women even helped draft Afghanistan's third constitution and were elected as representatives to parliament. But by the 1990s, we're seeing that women were part of the workforce. And that drastically would change after the rise of the Taliban, and women and girls were systematically discriminated against and marginalized, and their human rights were really violated during this time. So we're coming into a kind of history or a blip in time where we're seeing these changes, these extreme changes happening, and then a call from the president to start to think about how do you plan for a shift in the way that women can live within the city. So on the next slide, what you'll see is that part of our planning process was thinking about how women will become key catalysts for innovation and economic growth. They will be leaders in neighborhood regeneration. They are anchors in their communities. And a lot of the times they already are, but this isn't necessarily visible. So in our process, what we did as we actually worked with an amazing photographer journalist, Kiana Hayeri, and hired her while she was in Kabul. And she was a person who would um, talk about her lived experience, but her work in itself began to document the kind of ways in which a lot of the residents, particularly women, lived within Afghanistan. And she would create a way that we could interview other activists, advocates for women's rights within a more just Kabul as part of this process. So on the next slide, what you'll see are some of the key questions that we had with different stakeholder groups, representative of the women of Kabul, in regards to their mobility patterns. How do they feel about public space? What are the current aspirations and common destinations? And on the next slide, what you'll find is the kind of safety and security aspects that were the everyday concerns that were happening with even a time of hope and reconstruction, that transportation was a major issue relative to feeling safe and how women would move throughout the city. Understanding the kind of unity and when it came to gender, ethnicity, age, physical ability that should be built into the city fabric. And then understanding the kind of programmatic basic services that women need within the city. So on the next slide, taking all of those kind of amazing interviews that we had to do virtually online with women, we created strategies that were built into this comprehensive urban design framework that looked to urban amenities and integrating women's centers and inclusive programming into the urban fabric. So for us, this was something on the next slide where we saw that education was an essential. It's drastically changed if you look at the news today and what the rights of women are in Kabul, which we'll speak to in our discussion. But in 2017, we were talking about education in regards to girls and their access to school and training, and the lack of educational systems for several causes that create an inability to kind of to progress in regards to economic access and thinking about what's happening relative to progressing and contributing to their families and neighborhoods. So the lack of education for women affects more than quality of life. It negatively impacts the national economy and opportunities for innovation and growth across the city. What we found was that more than half of Kabul's women, female population, lack a formal education. We also looked on the next slide to health and wellness as a cornerstone of any city's quality of life. And that given the volatility of recent decades, medical care and mental support services are really needed in Kabul. These issues are exacerbated by limitations placed on women's accessibility to healthcare and recreation facilities, and the lack of adequate facilities and poor overall health conditions that come with pregnancy and childbirth that make it riskier for Afghan women. So understanding the safety and security of women relative to just health and wellness was a big factor in this plan, and where we would talk about where those facilities could happen throughout the city. The next slide starts to show economic development. Women represent a significant untapped potential to contribute to the economy, and increasing the amount of women who are contributing to household incomes is very important. And what we found was only 20% of women in Afghanistan are in the workforce. So our interviews revealed a need for women employees in sectors such as medicine, engineering, education, and thinking about where those training and educational facilities are that can help, accommodate the kind of economic mobility. And of course, on the next slide, what we were talking about was a lot of great initiatives that are happening in Kabul as a city, and acknowledging and highlighting, uplifting and amplifying all the fantastic city initiatives that included ways that public art and names of public spaces would be named in honor of women, where typically their invisibility is veiled throughout the city, but also thinking about ways that the arts, educational programs, agricultural programs could be part of an awareness campaign of the role and rights of women within the city. On the next slide, what you'll see is that we integrated in our framework plan ways to incorporate women's centers and programs that would really focus on health and wellness, training, as well as educational opportunities. On the next slide, what you'll see as well is that we provided a programmatic kind of toolkit of how to think about the varieties of spaces and amenities that could be built into different neighborhoods, districts of the city of Kabul, and should be part of the way of thinking forward relative to future urban development. And then as we move forward, we talked about these neighborhood anchors and began to create images that really centered the residential population and made it very visible, the women of Kabul and the strength that they have relative to how they live and how significant they are to society within this work. So a second idea that came out of who are we planning for relative to women in Kabul was really moving to public spaces. And so on the next slide, we look to open space. How do you design comfortable and safe parks and neighborhoods across Kabul? And what we found on the next slide is that the traditional concept of a zenana is an idea of spaces dedicated to women, that it refers to these reserved spaces that are for women and managed by women. And can we create these public spaces for women throughout the city? And so that would take place in many different forms. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we began to incorporate ways to think about these open spaces within the city and where they would be dedicated to women and the needs that they have relative to their gatherings, and what they would like to do within those public spaces. Another kind of way that we saw this is just showing the kind of illustrations that again began to really make visible women within the city through the documentation of the future goals and aspirations for reconstructing Kabul. And so the third aspect of this was mobility. We heard a lot about the kind of improvements, again, for safety, for public transit, streets, and trails. As you think about, the construction of your circulation systems, how are you designing for children, for women, and where there may be safety and security issues? What we found going forward on the next slide is that a lot of women felt unsafe in the public transit that was happening, where they were discriminated against or felt that that there were some unkind things that were happening in those spaces, and that there were segregated buses that would accommodate women in one section as well as those kind of different stations and buses. And so as we moved forward on the next slide, what you'll find is that our mobility kind of design concepts would rethink the kind of design of where those stations were and the design of the actual station, but also thinking about minivan shuttle services that are run by women for women, taxi services, as well as of ways to kind of even thinking about the structure of the bus and where people have certain areas so they felt like they were not going to be harassed. And so part of this was, again, kind of creating a way that looking at the citywide systems and who we're designing for, how do we start to think about the beautiful gardens and civic kind of landmarks that exist and building future development that would start to think about the economic kind of investment of these areas of old and new over time. On the next slide, it was about understanding the connections and where mobility improvements would happen relative to safety. And then on the next slide, really thinking about the ecology of the river, stormwater, rain gardens, and in riparian kind of buffer zones that would integrate all of these kind of environmental systems into a meaningful way in which we're understanding future city making in this kind of reconstruction. All is to say that on the next slide, there's this kind of overlay and integration of programs specifically for women who are, again, not accommodated with basic services in the city, and making sure that those are built into future kind of development. And so we have one more section Ali Khan will be presenting, which will be ways that we're talking about implementation and how we're thinking about that. And then we'll open it up to all of your questions and have a discussion.
Great. So one One huge part of implementation, as we've tried to present, was just the idea of creating a vision that was powerful and long-lasting. But at the same time, there's a huge volume of projects, a complexity involved, that needed to be broken down, and needed to have the capacity developed to understand it, and implement it. One of the first things that we did actually within the project schedule and scope was to provide implementation and capacity building guidance to our direct counterparts. So over the course of the project, we developed a collection of resources based on precedents and best practices from across the globe. For example, we drew heavily on the lessons of South Korea and Japan, which were both countries that had successfully rebuilt cities and economies after major conflict, and were both actually involved in different aspects of the reconstruction in Afghanistan. So we tried to pull and adapt fundamental concepts like land readjustment and value capture to help structure and manage the actual different pressures and challenges that neighborhoods and areas of Kabul were facing. Another example is we identified an opportunity to develop a special economic zone adjacent to the Kabul airport. We sort of incorporated and pulled on policy precedents and best practices, but then imagined how that might look and play out as part of Kabul's urban fabric. We developed specific capacity building modules that tailored these resources to the Afghan context and actually allowed the planners in Kabul to follow along with us and learn some of the ways that we, for example, did data and analysis, the way that we created 3D models and architectural concepts so that they fully could be part of the process. When the time came to update this plan, they would have the tools to unpack it, and they would have the actual files and data. And then finally, to actually give them the capacity to take some of these ideas and some of these methods and to use them in the other major regional capitals across Afghanistan. A second key pillar was to strengthen and clarify the roles of urban planning institutions at all levels of government. We had to understand that not only were we rebuilding from a conflict, but with 30 years of sort of conflict and instability, many of the national institutions had kind of been lost. A lot of the institutional knowledge that had been built in the 1970s, the coordination, the education had been lost. So we wanted to understand what was there, what were the different institutions at the national level, the city level, as well as the local district level, and some of the kind of community bottom-up, neighborhood governments, and really be clear about where this document and this initiative fit in and how each of those different levels of government and administration would play a role in implementing this. We mapped out how this long-term and strategic planning document could govern and coordinate more detailed neighborhood plans, as well as ongoing operations and development regulation. And for example, one of the key challenges that we were faced with, or that our counterparts in the city mentioned, was that planning was very centralized. It was done by the Ministry of Urban Design at the central level. As a result, the planners who worked for the different municipalities didn't have the capacity to interpret and carry out these plans and these ideas on the day-to-day level. So one key aspect and strategy of implementation was to transfer that knowledge to involve the local planners and build the capacity to work between the visioning and the long-term planning group of people and the day-to-day implementation and management group of people. We also thought about coordinating across different silos, particularly in terms of infrastructure. We mapped the responsibilities across the different sectors in silos. You can see there are dozens and dozens of different organizations. This was especially important in the context of reconstruction as many of these different entities had separate portfolios with funding from different international aid groups, and there was no overarching mechanism to coordinate how these different projects would fit together. So it's very important that this plan was not just a vision or a product of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing, but that we spoke to and incorporated existing plans and priorities from all of the other different groups and entities. We tried to distill, to the extent possible, all of these complex and interdisciplinary projects into a very clear list of action items that were sorted by the type of project, the lead implementers, as well as sequencing considerations, so that each actor could clearly see what their responsibility was and how they fit into this broader portfolio of projects. And we did this both in terms of mapping, but also a detailed table, and kind of almost a living document. And we try to, wherever possible, provide benchmarks and kind of level setting for what success meant and how all of these projects would map over time to come together as a complete urban network. Finally, we were asked by President Ghani to identify quick wins. The city was really in need of momentum and inspiration. So we identified about a dozen projects that would serve to build momentum, facilitate capacity building and collaboration across different stakeholders, and put a stake in the ground as the first step towards one of the larger projects or strategies here. So an example of this was a design concept for the Kabul River Promenade. This is a very kind of highly visible stretch along the river right downtown. It would support collaboration across ongoing priorities by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture that was already revitalizing and preserving some of the historic old city fabric that you can see around the river. The Kabul municipality that was hoping to implement roadway and streetscape improvement projects along the river, as well as the Ministry of Environment that had a long-term agenda of really revitalizing and increasing the ecological health of this river corridor throughout the whole city. And so what we did for each of these projects was to try and define a very clear scope and put together a high-level concept that would be detailed enough and confined enough to enable direct feasibility and engineering studies, cost estimates, identify funding, and understand what types of activation and operation would be needed, so that there's a very clear path for each of these to be implemented within, you know, one to 2 years. And again, once you have that really tangible experience that people could see, you know, it shows progress and it kind of builds towards this larger vision. So again, in terms of implementation, how do we provide hands-on training and capacity building in the moment as part of the project? How do we strengthen institutions through the implementation of these projects? How do we actually identify governance mechanisms, financing mechanisms, and link them to best practices that have been successful in other places? And then finally, how do we prioritize and break out this massive and complex vision into actions that are clear and achievable and have clear responsibilities? So with that, I'll turn it over back to Marianne just to speak to a couple of points, you know, and tie everything together.
Great, thank you. So in conclusion, some of the lessons learned from Kabul as seen throughout this presentation are listed on the next slide, where we are focused on ways that we're thinking about building local capacity. So if we go to that next slide, Ali Khan, one is we want to build local capacity and expertise, obviously, to create sustainable planning institutions at all levels of government. And so part of this was us working with the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing to understand, and we can talk about, I see one of the questions here is about like what is critical to that kind of local capacity that's needed relative to making decisions and planning in Kabul. But for us, it was everything from how you're using ways to map data and understanding the data sets of topography, the terrain, access through kind of road networks and so forth that we can speak to. But building that local capacity is really important if you want to sustain a model of planning that would be continuously learning and having more people learn about the ways to utilize data for decision making. Two, finding ways to plan with limited data and lots of uncertainties. And so we came into this process with an awareness towards the data that we would have, but going to great lengths to working with other organizations and realizing that we had all kinds of different data sets that did not match or align. And so we had to create assumptions about the data that we did have, and then we had to fill the gaps of the data that we didn't have and work with these uncertainties by documenting assumptions that would be projecting ways forward based off those assumptions. Third, acknowledging the impact of ongoing conflict on economic development and investment. Um, this was very important in regards to a city that wanted to attract international investment into the economy here in a way that we knew with the news and the ongoing kind of political events that could change at any time and was changing. And so realizing that, understanding what plan B, C, and D would be relative to where you could make a difference with economic development from quick wins to more long-term visions was part of this work. And then balancing international support with local institutions was very key because the local institutions were on the ground and had so much more knowledge, of course, but with international support, beginning to build up the capacity of benchmarking trends and different approaches that might lend themselves to ways to thinking about planning within these local institutions was helpful. There was an exchange on both parts. The next slide starts to also show that we use the urban planning process as a way to build a shared vision for many different stakeholders. So the planning process would allow us to have conversations that had not been had and to talk about a variety of different issues from engineering and infrastructure to economic development to housing and population increases and begin to really connect different folks together who can stay informed but also shape the future through those conversations. Highlighting tangible opportunities for collaboration and integration across systems was very important. Tangible opportunities meant that we had to figure out what the spatial design strategies were and how they could work across environmental, mobility, cultural, land use kind of systems and how those work together. Translating broad citywide national goals to the immediate needs of a specific community or neighborhood was also very important. That we would zoom into very specific conditions and characteristics in historic kind of areas of which we were respectfully preserving while also thinking about the improvements that needed to be made and how it could be realized through a spatial strategy. Identifying concrete projects and implementation actions, listing, making sense of, and beginning to suggest recommended projects in correspondence with the ministry, as well as implementation actions based off the way in which culturally the planning and government kind of entities were already implementing? What are the lessons that we learned, and how could we start to improve those implementation actions? And then evaluating time and urgency as a major driver for realistic implementation. And so quick wins were small projects that were feasible, affordable. It could show change very quickly, but also looking at terms such as short term, medium term, and long term, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and more. How are those strategies created over a phased approach was very important. So each project begins to build up and incrementally add up to something bigger than the sum of the parts, but into a larger vision. And so with that, I would say that these were some of the lessons that we learned with the reconstruction and the rebuilding of Kabul from 2017 to 2019 through this planning effort. I think with this work, and Ali Khan and I can speak to this with the questions, Kabul in Afghanistan at large has gone through a completely different kind of political change since the 2020s, where in this case, the Taliban began to pretty much come back into Kabul. The US would withdraw troops. There would be a US Taliban peace agreement that would be signed in 2020. But ultimately, the Taliban would capture Kabul, and the Afghan government would collapse with that change of who was governing Kabul in Afghanistan. And so the work that we see here is part of a kind of historic kind of vision of how a previous leader of, Afghanistan embarked on change. That change would happen and stop immediately in 2021 relative to some of the things that we were recommending through these strategies. But Ali Khan can also talk to you about some of the things that still are seeds that live on from this work with the new kind of leadership in Kabul. Ali Khan, do you want to speak to that?
Specifically thinking about the evolution of this vision and this plan, we both formally as a firm and informally as individuals have taken on additional projects and I think kept the connections going. So one example is that Kiana Hayeri is still in Afghanistan. She is still advocating for women's rights and trying to tell those stories. And she actually published a very incredible, but also, tough piece interviewing women now and talking about the differences. And so just through the people that we interacted with, those dialogues are still ongoing. I also know that the Aga Khan Development Network is still working in country, and that they are using some of the capacity building materials and examples from our work to work locally with planners in minority areas. And then just speaking to, and this is perhaps most important, there's a diaspora of Afghan urban planners who are now working in Australia, in the US, in the UK, who worked with us, and they kind of keep these ideas with them, and they're learning now from their context, but I think each and every one of them, will be back, or is waiting to go back, when the situation changes. And so this document may be on hold, but I think that to the extent that's possible, we've created something together with all of the different stakeholders that is kind of ready to be put back in action or serve as a resource once those conditions enable it.
So I know there are a list of questions, and we're happy if there's a way in which we can address them. I don't know if there's any best practices relative to past presentations like this that we can learn from. Thank you. So I think Ali Khan will start maybe with the more recent questions and work our way up. Maybe that would be a good way to do it. I can reiterate the question and then I will start and maybe you can add to it as we go through them. But I think that the first question that I'm seeing at the end, knowing there are many, is just thinking about, through all the work that was done for the planning, the capacity building, and the engagement and the ideas that came out of our planning framework for Kabul. The question is, you know, how do we learn from this? How do you provide assistance and mistakes in rebuilding? Like, where do you learn from that, and how can we prevent something like this? I think I'll just answer starting with the idea was that we knew from the beginning of this project that there could be significant change, of which everything that we're doing could stop abruptly and or not be implemented in a way because of the fact that there were a lot of geopolitical kind of forces at play. So I think we came in with a hope in a way of working that was optimistically cautious in regards to what we could do from our position as private consultants working with a government that was unstable. And so for us, it was about moving forward with a kind of ambitious optimism to provide as much kind of capacity building in a way of working that would highlight an approach to planning that served to take on basic services, to human rights, to ways that we were engaging people and thinking about like the economy and the environment and the culture all as one kind of comprehensive vision. There was no way that we would be able to ever prevent what is now the case, of course, but to do our job in as responsible of a way as possible was for us to one, acknowledge that it could abruptly change and end at any time during the process, but that these documents, the data sets, the way that we were thinking and planning together with all of the great people that we worked with would be embedded in the kind of practices that they could maintain and carry on, even if it would be abruptly ending, changing, or evolving, that we would have this history together of building and learning and exchanging and thinking about the significant kind of investment towards infrastructure that would be needed and just documenting what was happening.
I would also add that, it is important to understand the positionality, right? That I think as urban planners, we can support and help to realize reconstruction and reconciliation efforts, but there are deeper foundations. And I think that is Marianne, what you were getting at. The other thing is that it does not matter, well, regardless of the stability or instability, water still has to come, plumbing still has to work, buildings and houses still have to be developed, and people will do that on their own if there is no support or coordination. And I think one thing that really struck us is that there had been no stability in Afghanistan for over 20 years, and the city had still grown, by massive leaps and bounds, and people had still built their own housing, built neighborhoods informally without coordination. And there was still, and there still is, Ministry of Urban Development and Housing in some way. They just lack the agency and capacity to do their jobs well. And so I don't think there's a clear and easy answer, but the process of city making and building will happen regardless. And so I think, just the question is, how do we create a touch point so that when it is possible, that work can happen in a coordinated manner, and whoever is doing that work under the radar, they might not be political or part of the administration. They have some tools and something to work with.
Another question focuses on, and I'm going to bundle some of the questions together. I think we have about 10 minutes, so I want to be mindful of time, and respectful of people's time. But I do believe that there's questions relative to the environmental kind of forces or systems where the issue of accessibility in Kabul relative to water and riverbeds. What is the role of rivers and bridges in Kabul? And then just how another question relative to that was, what are the programs for some of the green areas along the river? Do you want to start, Ali Khan? Just understanding the river, the role of the river, the bridges, and what programmatically is happening relative to the river.
Sure. So the Kabul River runs through the city. It's fed by snowfall and mountain rivers. The actual condition was that it had not been flowing consistently for many years, and it was kind of seen as a just a place to dump trash. It was full of pollution, and that was true of many of the smaller neighborhood waterways throughout Kabul. And so the larger vision of the environmental department was actually to understand what was happening with climate change in the mountains, understand how that would affect the flow of the rivers. And at the city scale, the first priority was really to undertake a campaign to clean up the rivers and to block all of the sort of buildups that was stopping the river from flowing. And I think that was kind of a very long-term systemic priority. And to build momentum, the idea was to find these smaller places where you could create moments for people to appreciate the rivers, and have improvements around the rivers.
Great. Maybe we show a slide, Ali Khan, of the comprehensive kind of plan in case people wanted to see some of the areas, or we can go to sharing it so that we see people's faces, either one, so that helps explain anything. I think then how were analytics collected and statistical data compiled, thinking about the long term and stay of the population outside of the country. And so I think, with that, would you like to speak to that a little bit, Ali Khan, as far as the collection of data sets and how we started compiling data, knowing that we have a floating population?
Yeah, I think there's three things to point out. One is that this was even though this was only 6 or 7 years ago, I think we're in a very different context. Remote sensing was still an emerging technology then. Not a lot of people were aggregating or uploading data to Yelp or Google. And so I think that there's a lot of possibilities today that we currently draw on that weren't available at that time. So it really was a struggle with data. And we did a lot just by zooming in on satellite maps, by looking at photos that people had taken on Instagram, just to get a sense of the place. The second thing is that there was actually a lot of data available considering the context. And that was because there was so much investment from different countries and aid organizations. The UN Habitat has a fantastic and very comprehensive set of data called the State of Afghan Cities, where they actually, from from a top-down perspective, map the land uses, existing land uses in the 6 largest cities in the country. So that was for us a foundational data source. The UNHCR, Council for Refugees, had incredible data about population movement, IDPs, and refugees. So that was another foundational data set. The Food and Agriculture Organization from the US had an amazing data set on ecological land uses and agriculture. So part of this was identifying what those foundational data sets were and really trying to make the most of them. And the second thing is that these organizations weren't necessarily talking to each other. So it was the process of overlapping those data sets, which really brought out a richness. So I think in the case of Ukraine, there's a lot of technology around remote sensing that can probably be used. But I would also say, try to coordinate and work with the international organizations that will or might be focusing on Ukraine through the process of reconstruction. And then the final thing is, where data is uncertain, don't try to make it up. I think we went through a struggle where for example, we looked at these different sources, the World Bank, the UN Habitat, the official Kabul municipality statistics. Even the mayor and sort of local government couldn't tell us whether there were 3 million people or 5 million people. So we kind of thought outside the box and says, look, what we do know is that there are probably going to be about 2 million additional people that you need to accommodate as a city by 2025 or 2030. So let's focus on what we do know and work with that.
So other questions include, is there tourism in Kabul? Yes, there is a little bit of tourism in Kabul. Since the Taliban governed Kabul, there is some tourists, but I believe with safety issues, visas, it's not a large tourist population that visits Kabul. Another question is, we are sure there are, part of your work in Kabul, you have implemented training programs for NGOs, which are still under reconstruction. What competencies are crucial as far as the kind of training programs for NGOs? Ali Khan, do you want to start? I can end.
Sure. I would actually, in some ways, flip that question backwards and say that NGOs were a huge resource for us, and that maybe the biggest contribution we made for them was to uplift and highlight the work that they had done. And so whether it was working with women or smaller kind of preservation nonprofits, the fact that this document was, it kind of had the authority and the stamp of the national government meant that actually just uplifting them as a best practice, giving them a voice and supporting their work was the most powerful thing that we could do, and just respect and learn from their work. I think that the capacity building really depends on the NGO sector, but if anything, it was trying to communicate the ability to really think across sectors. And so give, for example, a environmental organization a little bit of a primer on affordable housing strategies so that they could work with each other, and vice versa. I think we respected the depth of knowledge of each organization, and it was more about creating those connections.
Great, we have a hand.
I would like to round up I would like basically to consolidate the questions which were not put in the chat. Two more. The first one, we have a question about security. Did you use the security issue within planning? So also another mountainous area or other environmental. Do you take it into account while planning? Do you have within your document the question connected with the security issue, etc., with some threats?
I think that safety and security relative to city making was evident in the way that we were looking towards mobility, understanding where development would take place, but also realizing that there were zones in which there were very tall walls for protection and visibility, and ways that you're beginning to create transition zones within the city where there were land uses such as government buildings and just very important areas to protect and to kind of think about in a different manner relative to safety and security. So from a kind of spatial planning, urban design perspective, we had to identify ways in which we could strengthen safety through ways that infrastructure development, open space buffers, or any kind of apparatus of site wall and view sheds were incorporated into significant areas of the city. That was one way that we did do it. I think that from a temporary, I saw relative to shelters and places of refuge. I think that those, since we were working within a long-term kind of planning vision, those were discussed to some degree, but were more tactical as opposed to strategic planning when it came to our urban design framework.
I think the context was also very, very different, where the civilian population was generally not a huge, well, there was definitely danger, but the main targets or the main danger was to businesses and people who were seen to be aligned with either the administration or actually international investment. And so the focus was maybe on understanding what areas were really important for security, and to actually recognize that a lot of the security measures for example, international NGOs or government agencies were actually really detrimental for the way that local people or sort of normal people could move around the city. So one example of that thinking was to have to designate, an SEZ right next to the airport, and to recognize that as an area that needed to be a little bit isolated or secured as a place where, people from different places could come into Afghanistan. A second larger idea was that there were a lot of embassies and government facilities right downtown in the area called a green zone. And that just meant, every road, every artery of the city went through there, and it was blocked. And so one major idea was to consolidate the government, military, international aid facilities in a new area that could, in the long term, become like a real civic seat of government, but in the short term, essentially free up and reduce the need for really heightened security in the center of the city. So I think the strategy was more at that level for this, at least for this initiative.
Я спробую дуже швидко.
I would like very briefly.
Питання це навіть не питання, а вже підсумування.
It's not a question, actually, it's like a conclusion. I would like to say thank you to our speakers today for finding time. It's of great value for us. It's not just, puzzles, separate puzzles. No, these are the insights from you to step into your shoes, for us, and to think what we do if we were in your shoes in the Kabul's context. We saw some guidelines, right? You showed as for the directions. Is it possible for us to find these resources? Or you could share them with us? It's a question. And the last question for you, if you had to start reconstruction in Ukraine, what would be the first thing that you would recommend us to do? And Marianne, is this a question for both of you?
Oh, thank you. And I'm sorry, I have to leave very soon, so I may have to jump off a little earlier than Ali Khan. But I do believe that guidelines, I think that at this point, these were pretty private relative to the guidelines that we were consulting the president on. And so, unfortunately, they are not public. But there might be ways that we share some kind of best practices relative to guidelines that we can send to you as you think through it. I do believe when it comes to Ukraine and what's happening there, I think that I mean, quite honestly, I think it would mean engaging with you all to understand as far as the initial steps of like what does success look for reconstruction for Ukraine as we hear from you, what the kind of needs are, what the challenges are, what are ways in which you've been practicing, but how do you start to reconstruct or rebuild in such a way that in my mind it becomes a way that it goes beyond what you had and it becomes a kind of a resiliency approach that accommodates needs that you didn't have addressed at that point. So I guess what I'm saying is that as you think about rebuilding or rethinking and resilience relative to towns, cities of Ukraine, what are things that were challenges before there was any type of major kind of warfare or on the ground kind of changes of destruction? What things are happening that you can accommodate in your planning that address needs that have been there for many decades? And how do you build in who you're designing for into your process as we think about residents, but also looking towards, the folks that are more vulnerable or marginalized in planning processes in general? How do you engage them in the kind of rebuilding of your towns and cities?